I'm so excited to be here and have the opportunity to share a little bit about what I do, what I have been doing for the last 10 plus years. It's looked different because I was only going to keep this one up for a short time because that's really a bit frightening with my picture. But I do think the change that we're talking about today, the change that we want to see in the world that we live in and we operate in, can happen one conversation at a time, and it's through continual learning that we can get there. So like I said, I've been doing this work for over 10 years. A lot of the time in that 10 years, it was sat at my desk. It was just something that was a really big passion for me. When I started, it was to see more women in leadership that looked like me. I actually worked in a couple different organizations here in Edmonton. One of them was actually an engineering firm as well. And I would look up and I wouldn't see people who looked like me. And so I wanted to be part of that change. And so I'll share in my presentation the evolution that I've witnessed in terms of how do we create an inclusive space for everyone. And so I'm talking about one that involves women of color moving into leadership roles. But as I've spent time in this space, I want us to maybe think about using the acronym IDEA: inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, because I have also witnessed in the last few years the hierarchy within what we've called the DEI space, the D&I space. It's gone through a lot of changes, but accessibility doesn't always make the list. So before I talk about building knowledge and how we need to ground ourselves in common knowledge, I just want to do a quick acknowledgement of the land that we are on today, Treaty 6 territory. And very similar to how I'm going to share knowledge with you, that's how I learn and get to understand more about truth and reconciliation. So you'll see up here, 6 books. And I've been on a journey for the last 2 years reading about Indigenous people, their struggles, what they have gone through, and really grounding myself in a new learning, because I think back to when I was a child here in Edmonton and how Indigenous people were talked about, how that was my frame of reference. And so I want to create that change. So I want us all to think about how we can build upon that knowledge. And I definitely recommend all of these books. I started with From the Ashes by Jesse Thistle. It's a story of his journey and growing up Métis, having a really hard childhood. But now, hard childhood. He was homeless for 11 years, came out of that and is now a professor at York University. So each of these books has their own story, but I think it is part of my journey as I learn to acknowledge the land that we live on. So how do we start to build this knowledge? I think it's incumbent upon organizations, obviously, to understand this, how it impacts their business, how they need to think differently. It's not about adding another priority to the long list of activities that organizations do on a day-to-day basis. The busyness that we all face inside of organizations, there's always something to do. I think that diversity and inclusion really is about creating a lens in which we see the world through. It's no surprise that the last 2 years have taught us the continued complexity that we have in our world. It's not only within our organizations, but it's in the world around us. We probably all had moments during the pandemic where we just really didn't know what was going to come next. And so I think we might be a little bit on the outside of the conversation now. Part of that is that we're here together, which is really, really exciting. But that hasn't always been the case for the last 2 years. So we see the complexities from the pandemic, but we also see organizations becoming more complex in how they want to succeed as a business. So we can't leave behind the need to create an organization that's inclusive, that is actually thinking about all the people inside the organization, not just the majority. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention is this conversation continues to come up day after day after day. These are just some headlines within the last 2 years that really talk to the complexity that I just mentioned, and the conversations and the potential challenges that employees bring inside the organization, where they may not be able to show up and do their best work because they're thinking about the impacts of the pandemic on their community. They're thinking about the conversations that people might be having. The last one there, we witnessed the passing of the Queen, but also this conversation of what does it mean for colonization for Canada? And so I raise this for us to think about as we get to and move towards a place of inclusion. We have to be able to create the space to have conversations, one conversation at a time. If we aren't having those conversations, if we're not asking the questions, I love that reminder. If we're just going to go about our day and do things the same way that we've always done them, then the status quo remains. And I think we can all say that we're not happy with the current status quo. The other side of this too is to feel left out. And really, we've all probably had a story or two or many where we felt left out, that we don't feel that sense of inclusion. And this is truly a human problem. And so if we're not putting that at the forefront of our strategies, if we're not actually embedding this in why we want our organization to succeed. I've worked in a few different organizations. I've heard the term, we put people first. People are our most important priority, but then I see a lot of examples that don't necessarily align to that statement. So we have to think about how people are feeling as well in creating that sense of belonging. Okay, there we go. So the other thing too here, we can go, yeah, there's so many conversations about, well, we've got to think about the impacts on this community, and we've got to think about the impacts on that community, and how can I do all of this work? How can I be there for every single community? Well, I can tell you that when we get to the other side, when we get to a place of inclusion, people are going to show up and they're going to be able to do their best work. And I also think that the stories of progress tell us how important it is for us to continue to move in this direction. So there's a few examples up here. The one, I suppose, that's my favorite, and maybe most relevant for our conversation this morning. How many people have seen the movie Coda? 1, 2. I realize every time I ask this question, not a lot of hands go up because it's only available on Apple TV, so you have to have a subscription. But you can sign up for a 30-day free subscription and watch the film. And if you have the opportunity, I really encourage you to do so because it did win the Best Picture in this year. And it's about a family, 2 parents and 2 kids. The parents are deaf, as is one of the children. And so the one that can hear becomes the translator for the family through conversations in their small fishing village. But the point of me sharing this is they fought really hard when they cast this film to actually have the 3 individuals who were deaf actually be deaf actors. And it's 2022. They probably filmed it in 2021, but we still don't necessarily think about the realities of who we have access to, who can we bring into organizations, who are the people who can do these jobs, and we've got to challenge the status quo. Bean told us the example of, wearing glasses is a disability, yet it has been so normalized, yet in 2021, I think, maybe it was this year, when Encanto came out, and the main character wore glasses, that meant so much to children to see someone in that role. And so representation matters. And so obviously we're all here today to say, how can we create a space where we can have people with disabilities present inside of our organizations, making up like a quarter of our population, both visible and invisible disabilities, yet that representation is not equivalent inside of many organizations. So we all want to have that sense of belonging. We all want to know we are contributing to our highest potential. And I think about that every single day. I don't know the answer to every possible situation, but again, I'll have the conversation and figure out what are the connections that we need to make. How can we create the understanding to allow everyone to achieve their highest potential? One strategy that I think is really effective inside of organizations when we think about creating this inclusive space, this space where everyone can show up and be reach their highest potential, is leading with heart. And I want to leave you with some ideas in terms of what it means for you as an individual, what it means for the leaders inside your organizations, and truthfully, you're all leaders in the work that you do every single day. We don't have enough time for me to go into my other belief, but I think everyone is a leader, and I think you all have impact. It has nothing to do with your title. It has to do with your passion and how connected you are to creating change. So leading with heart. So HEART is an acronym. H is for humility, E is for empathy, A is for authenticity, R is for resiliency, and curiosity makes up the HEART acronym. I created this with a few other practitioners who do similar work to myself, and we wanted something that people would remember. There's a lot of leadership traits that are out there that I think are really important, and so we've tried our best to weave them into this acronym. But if we're going to show up and be able to do our best work, we have to do so with humility, because we don't know everything. We know everything about our own lived experience, but we won't know about someone else's until we sit down and we have a conversation with them and understand how we can help create a change that's going to make them reach their highest potential. I think we have sort of a broken system in terms of how we've thought about leadership inside of organizations, and that we have to know all the answers. We have to be right, but I don't think that's the new way that's going to move us forward. It's going to be that of us showing up with humility and removing ego from our conversations. When we think about empathy, I don't know how many people are familiar with Brené Brown, but she really has talked a lot about empathy and how we need to have that human connection with one another. And if we don't understand people's circumstances, we're not going to be able to have the empathy to, again, get to the best possible solution. And so that emotion that we feel, we are all human, needs to show up in the workplace as well. Authenticity is an interesting one, potentially, as you see this list. But for me, it's showing up in our truest form. It's sharing who we are. I'll tell a little funny story. I mentioned I've worked in a couple different organizations before I started my own business, and they were in the corporate world. And I unknowingly started showing up in the uniform, wearing the black pants, wearing the suit jacket, wearing the fancy shoes, and kind of existing in a sea of sameness, because I observed that as being what success looked like. Fast forward to, my enlightenment and thinking about how I want to show up in this world and realizing I love bright colors. I want to show my personality as I show up to work. I want to be my authentic self. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how am I showing up in my most authentic self. And the story is I was presenting to a room of pretty senior leaders, and I knew they were all going to be wearing suit jackets and their dress shoes and all of the uniform. And I thought for a moment, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't wear my jeans today. And I mean, that was like an upgrade, because I've been wearing Lululemon leggings for the last 2 years working from home. But I said, no, I'm going to wear my jeans. I'm going to wear these shoes for, if anyone can see them, They're white sneakers with rainbow laces. And I'm going to wear my fun floral blazer with all the colors. And I told them that. I said, I'm not going to show up in this room and not be my authentic self. And so that's part of being an inclusive leader, because you can role model to others and let them show up as their authentic self as well. Resiliency. This shows up in a couple different forms, but I will tell you, this work is hard. And not every single day do we wake up and we're like, well, I'm going to have to take some notes from being on the gratitude. But we don't win every conversation that we enter into. And maybe we shouldn't think about it as winning and losing, but we might walk away and go, I thought that change was going to be easy to implement inside my organization, but I just got told no by this team and this team and this team. And so resiliency to me is knowing that you might face those challenges, but what's the pivot? What's the direction that you can change slightly and go and ask someone else who can help champion the work that you want to get done inside your organization? When I worked in the engineering firm, I led diversity and inclusion across the globe. And I thought, okay, they're ready. They want to create this change. We are going to start to implement policies and practices that are going to be more inclusive to make sure that we are bringing in diverse candidates, that we are going to start to see a representation of our employees to the clients that we serve. There was a policy that we wanted to change to make sure that every job was going to be posted so that we could at least ensure people knew about these opportunities, because past practice has been, oh, I know someone who can fill that job. I'm just going to put them into it. So I don't know. I think it sort of makes sense to create that change to make sure that we're trying to reach the largest number of potential candidates. There's other strategies that go into making sure that we are thinking about the accessibility of those job postings. But for this specific example, it took 1 year for that change to be implemented because it had to go through approvals and wording, and legal had to sign off, and all of these things. And so resiliency is something that we have to know is part of this work. Even though we want change to happen overnight, it doesn't always. And curiosity, pulling in the T to create heart, is my favorite because I'm still learning. I don't know everything. My journey around accessibility has only truly started to happen in the last year. I put on a conference recently, and one of our keynote speakers is also a wheelchair user. She says, I'm a disabled person. She lost her ability to walk in her 20s as well. And she said, look around the room that we were in the conference room. And by the way, just fun fact, we worked so hard with the hotel. We said we need a ramp. We have someone who's coming in, who's going to need to use it. You would have been mortified at what they put out to try to get Christine up onto the stage, our speaker. Yeah, it was probably 45 degrees. It was terrible. And so it is still 2021, and we don't have all these solutions in place. And so anyways, the story is my curiosity and my learning. And Christine, our speaker, said, look around this room. Where are there things that we need to change? And I sat there and I thought, I don't know. I think maybe the tables are too close together. But that, and the ramp, because that was an obvious one, because she wasn't able to use it. But the whole room is carpeted. That's not easy for someone in a wheelchair. And I said, oh yeah, when I go to the airport and I'm trying to wheel my luggage down the corridor, and then I hit carpet, it becomes really hard. Oh, wheels don't really work well on carpet. Okay, I've now brought that into my knowledge. So a really small example for me, but that's my journey. That's my journey in curiosity, because I don't have that lived experience. And so I want to sit on the side of bringing that into my knowledge and into my awareness as an advocate for this work, as I try to make the connections to those who are doing the really good work to help amplify the voices of those that may not have the opportunity to have their voice heard as loud as others. So a few things for us to think about in terms of these, and I kind of walked through it, but I want you to think about what actions you can put in to action, which of these traits you can put into action today. Can you take this back to your organization and have a conversation about how these might be showing up inside your organization? What are you holding leaders accountable to? At the end of the day, the people in the highest positions of power are making the final decisions on, are we going to lean into inclusion? Are we going to help people think about those yummy moments that inclusion truly does create a better world for everyone? So how do we start to move forward? There are a lot of ways that we can. And so when I talk about this, I want you to think about your authentic self and how this resonates with you. You may not be able to action all of these tomorrow, but I hope there's something in here that you can take back as you think about how are we building our own diversity and inclusion strategies? How are we embedding it inside the organization, not having it be something that's additive, that if our goal is to grow the business, how are we going to do that in an inclusive way? So I'd mentioned Brene Brown already, but she says, and this just sort of goes to how are you showing up in the work that you do every single day, because it is indeed the one thing that we have control over. True belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our own level of self-acceptance. So whether or not that's a teachable moment for you, it can be a teachable moment inside your organizations in creating change agents, because I do think it is the collective of people doing small things within their control that will continue to lead us down a path of creating a more inclusive world. So here's some tools, here's some things that you can think about as you build strategy, as you think about how you show up in this space. It's about getting uncomfortable. Again, I don't know everything, so I'm going to be uncomfortable as I try to bring in new knowledge, new learning, new awareness. I was reflecting, actually. I don't know why I want to tell this story, but I'll tell it. It's been several years since the 94 calls to action was released. The report was released for us to see and read. And so what, it's been 7 years. We've probably started to do land acknowledgements in the last couple of years. But I was reflecting on Friday for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the second one we've had, and the number of people I saw wearing orange shirts. And reflecting on the number of people that participated in walks and in community events, and the conversations. I have 2 children, the conversations that they had in school. And I went and I thought, okay, maybe sometimes I sit on the side of saying we aren't doing enough, but change is happening. Change is slowly happening. So I think about that. Maybe I'll get this question from Doug in terms of DEEM, but that's the work that needs to be done. We need to continue to emphasize this year over year, and then we'll start to get that momentum. Change will start to happen. So get uncomfortable, listen to understand, use inclusive language. This is actually really interesting one. So certainly we can try to start using gender neutral language. We can make sure that we start to think about inclusive language when we say the term guys, for example. But what about manpower or manhole or a lot of gendered terms in our society, and trying to unlearn those and relearn maybe a more inclusive way of saying, hey everyone, instead of hey guys. Saying maintenance hole instead of manhole, manpower. workforce. There's different words that we can pull on, and if we start to redo and relearn more inclusive language, then more people will feel included. Understand the intersections. So Bean shared her story with us as a woman of color, wheelchair user. Those are 3 intersections in her identity. And sometimes, and I actually can speak to the data, I said when I started this work, it was around seeing more women in leadership that look like me. There has been advances for women in leadership, but if we look at the numbers, it's been for white women. It hasn't been for women of color, let alone women of color with disabilities. And so we have to spend the time to understand those intersections. And it might take us a little bit longer because we have to get to know different people's lived experience. But again, it helps to create a more inclusive world where we aren't leaving someone behind. Engage in allyship. There are so many ways for us to show up and be advocates in our own way. How do we listen? How do we learn? How do we understand and correct our own biases? We all have bias. It's the way our brains work. We can't fully eliminate bias, but we can interrupt bias. And so how do we bring that into our conscious awareness? For me, when making a hiring decision, I will want to potentially hire the woman because I want to see more women in leadership. But is that the best person for the job? And so I think about that in terms of people with disabilities. And I've heard a few stories actually during COVID where we, existed maybe a bit more in a virtual world, and people would do interviews, potentially get the job, and then as they're looking to onboard, the person would say, I just want to make sure your building's accessible because I'm a wheelchair user. And all of a sudden, they don't have the job anymore because they were sitting in front of their computer during COVID and doing the interview. So what changed? Very should that matter? And so I'm also conscious as I'm saying this, I'm using a very common example of what we think about, or what I've thought about, I should say, when thinking about disabilities. There are so many different components that we need to acknowledge, and this is the work that organizations have to do to build that knowledge, because I don't think they know. I just don't think they think about it, because I talked about that hierarchy. Diversity. Okay, we know we have underrepresentations of women, visible minorities inside of our organization, Indigenous people. What are we doing to create that change? We know we want to create an inclusive environment, so we want to create that sense of belonging. But what are we doing? We want equitable practices, so we make sure that we're hiring the best people for the job. But what are we doing in terms of accessibility? And so, here's the goal for next year, is that there's more people in this room to hear these conversations, more allies in this space so that they're on this journey with us. So I want to share a quick example, and then I'll wrap up in case there's any questions. So how many people know who Lizzo is? Okay. I love asking this question because I sometimes, again, I'm like, oh, of course everyone knows who Lizzo is. No, Erin, not everyone knows who Lizzo is. So Lizzo's a pop artist. She's actually been in the news recently for playing a 200-year-old flute, but we won't unpack that. If you're curious, look it up, because there's some undertones of racism in that story, but we don't have enough time to go into it today. Anyways, Lizzo released a song in June, and the disability community came out and said, hold on, there's a term in there that you use that is actually really derogatory. We don't like that word being used. And I will give you, because I'm not going to say the word, it's on the screen if you can see it. I don't want to repeat it, but it's more commonly used in the UK and Australia. So I want to give that context, because I actually don't think it is probably part of our everyday language, but if it is, it's maybe an idea of thinking about more inclusive language. So this goes out on Twitter. Hey, Lizzo, just wanted to let you know. Then, of course, we live in the world that we live in, and everyone goes, yep, it's time, let's cancel Lizzo. But the disability community came back and said, no, we don't want to cancel Lizzo. We love what she stands for, but we want to create the knowledge and awareness that that word just really isn't something we want continued to be said and shared. So Lizzo comes back, she issues an apology, and she rewrites, re-records, and re-releases the song within 24 hours. And she said, thank you for helping me learn. I think the most important part here, and what I'll end on, is what Ali Henny said. Lizzo engaged in casual and unintentional ableism and literally rewrote, re-recorded, and re-released an entire song overnight to rectify the situation. She even managed to write a decent apology to boot. I don't want to hear any more about how your school, church, workplace, city government, nonprofit, corporation, or other institution can't construct and follow through with a plan to combat racism. I think that we can add a lot of isms in that statement and think about what this means for ableism as well. And change can happen, especially when we have change agents who are willing to do the work. So moving forward, I encourage you to think about the small actions that you can take. How do you lead with heart every single day? How do you have clumsy conversations? Again, we don't have it all figured out, but through those conversations, we can sure start to create a pathway forward. And think about a day in your life and where are there opportunities for change. One more quote from me, and then I'm done. This is Sonia Renee Taylor. She says, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all humanity and nature. So I hope that we can all move forward together in stitching that new garment." Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Erin Davis.
Thank you.
I won't press you on that question just yet. I had an unfair advantage. One of the reasons why I didn't do a land acknowledgement at the start was because I saw your slide deck at the start.
Yeah.
So I knew you were actually going to be touching on that subject. You know, the last couple of days, especially with National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, very important. You know, it's more about reflection and learning more than anything
Absolutely.
else. Instead of, say, for example, myself going up and speaking out of turn and telling people what to do. How do we look at reflecting and learning just as people?
I think that we figure out what feels authentic to us, and quite often I share resources. I have like the longest list of Netflix shows that people can watch if that's what sort of like what you do in the evenings, or podcasts or books. That's why I share my reading list. I think that we all have access to information. Like, whatever our thoughts are in Google, there's so much information out there at our fingertips. And so we can learn and we can understand the translation of, yeah, it's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but what am I doing in this? And then that becomes your land acknowledgement the next time you're in a meeting. And so I really encourage people to move beyond sort of the programmed language that we are on Treaty 6 territory, Métis 4 nation, and really start to think about how are you personally showing up and what's your pathway towards reconciliation.
You also spoke about clumsy conversations. How do we even open those conversations?
Really good question. So something I didn't have in my slide deck, but I often share in rooms is how do we set the tone for these conversations? How do we set expectations? How do we create brave spaces saying, it's okay to fail. It's okay to say the wrong thing because I've got you. And I'm not gonna be like, don't ever say that again. I'm gonna say, can I give you some feedback? And if you're not willing and ready to listen, that's okay. but we're all human. We're going to mess up. Like, everyone talks about this. And so I don't think, I wouldn't have had it in this deck, but quite often I've talked about blind spots. And then I've had a bit of an internal reflection of like, well, that's not really probably a great way to talk about it. So I now say gaps in knowledge. And so I try to share my examples with the world, but do it with one person. Sit down and say, let's talk about this uncomfortable conversation. Let's, talk about the death of the Queen and what that means on colonization, if that's something that you're curious about. So create the safety to have that conversation, and once you do it once, then you know that you can do it again.
If you didn't notice, there was actually Cree language on your decks as well, right?
Yeah.
How has your journey just in life created your goals going forward in helping other people and other organizations?
Well, that's a really good question. I think when I got to the realization that I can't fix everything, that I would make a goal of what's within my control. And so I do think about that a lot. And I think about continuing to grow my network and my connections. It's another way to think about an action you can take is how are you building a diverse network and how are you bringing in new knowledge? And so I'm constantly sort of reflecting on that within my own personal goals and saying, okay, I've taken on this new knowledge. I've connected with these new people. Well, who else? Who's next? How am I going to expand that?
Final question for you. I won't keep you on the spot too much longer. How do we change the status quo?
We change the status quo by understanding what we're passionate about and operating from that place. And so I think it's by asking questions and saying, why are we doing it that way? And I think that's, if I'm going to be like honest and truthful, which I usually am, I asked a lot of questions in the organizations I used to work in, and then I kind of felt like my voice wasn't being heard and my ideas weren't being taken into consideration. And so I always said, it's these organizations' loss if I ever leave. And so I own my own business now, and I think that truthfully is part of my journey, that I wasn't able to ask those questions. I was able to like say them out loud at the table, but no one really acknowledged them. No one really had the conversation. And so it's finding the people inside the organization that are going to listen to those questions and say, why are we always doing it this way? There's got to be a better way. And I think for me, as I reflect over my career too, I've always sort of thought, yeah, that's an okay way of doing it, but I think there's a better way. So when we do it next time, how can we do it better?
Very insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, the lovely Erin Davis.